war on drugs around the world. He spent 3 years and traveled 30,000 miles to report on the story.
I'm super thrilled to be hosting what I think is the first talk we've ever hosted for a book that has been blurbed by both Noam Chomsky and Elton John. This blew my mind. So that is really also terribly exciting. And then finally, I'm excited to have a book that says something a little new about the drug war. We all know the drug war is bad and awful, right? I don't need to tell you that, right? If you're living in Baltimore, you know that the drug war is bad and awful. But what is really exciting when someone with the talents at writing, at journalism, like Johann Hari comes along and is able to kind of look at that history, look at where we are today, talk to people, go to places, figure out a way to tell this story in a way that makes us see new things, that gives us a different lens and a different optic on something that we know is horrible. And in telling that story, gives us a way to deal with it and create a better future. So I'm really terribly excited to welcome him here to Red Emma's, and I'm glad you all came out. Thank you.
Yes, thanks. Hey, thank you for coming. When the war on drugs was being launched, the man who launched it, Harry Anslinger, said there was one place in the world that proved more than any other that it was going to work. He said if you looked at this place, it would prove that if you cracked down hard enough, if you arrested enough people, if you were consistently tough, drugs and drug gangs would disappear. That place was Baltimore. How's it working out for you? I'm really glad to be here. I feel like before I start, I should kind of apologize for something, which you might be able to tell from my voice. I'm not from here. And I've spent a lot of time in the US, and I've never felt self-conscious about it until I was working on this book. I went to Tyler County in Texas. I don't know if any of you have ever been there. If you haven't, don't. And I went to interview this hitman, the only hitman for the worst Mexican drug cartel who's ever made it out and lived to tell the story. He's in prison there. And I went into a branch of Jack in the Box. Do you guys have that in Baltimore? Do you know what it is? It's like a fast food chain, which is responsible for at least one of my chins. And I went in there and I said to the woman, "Can I have like a quarter pounder with cheese?" And she said to me, "What?" And I said, could I have a quarter pounder with cheese? And she said to me, I can't do the accent, I apologize. She said, "Do you speak English?" And I said, "Madam, my people invented it." But she didn't laugh. What I want to talk to you about, as I said before, it's now 100 years since drugs were first criminalized. And as I realized we were coming up to this centenary, I had a kind of very personal reason for wanting to think about it. We had a lot of drug addiction in my family. One of my earliest memories was of trying to wake up one of my relatives and not being able to. And I realized that even though this had been going on for 100 years, there were loads of really basic questions that I just didn't know the answer to. And that my teachers had never told me, my government had never told me, your government had never told me, no one had told me. Why were drugs banned in the first place? Why do we carry on with the drug war approach when a lot of people think it isn't working? What really causes drug use and drug addiction? And what are the alternatives? And I realized that part of the problem with the drug war, I think, is that we talk about it in such an abstract way. If you read most writing about the drug war, it's like you're sitting in a philosophy seminar arguing about how the world should be. I thought, screw that, I want to find out how it really affects real people all over the world. So I set off on this journey. I didn't think it would be quite as long as it was when I started, but I ended up going across 9 countries, 30,000 miles, and just sitting and spending time and talking with loads of different people, from a transsexual crack dealer in Brownsville, Brooklyn, to a scientist who spends a lot of time feeding hallucinogens to mongooses to see if they like them. It turns out they do, but only in very specific circumstances. To the only country in the world that's ever decriminalized all drugs, from cannabis to crack, with incredible results. And I think the main thing I took away from this is almost everything we think we know about this subject is wrong. Drugs are not what we think they are. Drug addiction is not what we think it is. The drug war is not what we've been told it is for 100 years. And the alternatives are not what we think they are. And what I'd like to do, because I tell the story in the book through the stories of real people whose lives were changed one way or another by this war, or the alternatives, I want to talk to you tonight just about 5 or 6 of the people that I talk about in the book. One of them's one of your homegirls. In 1939, Billie Holiday stood on stage in New York City and she sang a song called Strange Fruit. It's a song against lynching. her goddaughter Lorraine Feather said to me, "You've got to understand how shocking this was, to have an African-American woman standing in front of a white audience in a hotel where she was not allowed to walk through the front door. She went through the service elevator, singing a song against lynching." And that night, according to her biographer, Julia Blackburn, Billie Holiday received a threat, a warning, from the Federal Bureau of Narcotics. They said, "Stop singing this song." The man who ran that bureau was a guy called Harry Anslinger. He's the most influential person no one's ever heard of. He was the founder. He took over the Department of Prohibition just as alcohol prohibition is ending. And he had to find a new purpose for his department. And he was driven by two really strong hatreds. One was a hatred of addicts, the other was a hatred of African Americans. This is a guy who was regarded as a crazy racist by the crazy racists in the 1930s, right? He used the N-word in official police memos so often that his own senator said he should have to resign. And Billie Holiday, you look at his files, his writing, he was obsessed. Billie Holiday was everything he hated. It was an African-American woman standing up to white supremacy. It was a heroin addict. It was a, he thought jazz, it's really interesting when you read it, he thought jazz was this kind of mongrel, evil music that was disordered and a sign of chaos, and he would write these memos where he'd listen to the lyrics like, when he gets the motion, he thinks he can walk across the ocean, and he'd write, "That is what they do think when they use heroin." Billie Holiday grew up here in Baltimore when it was the last city in the United States that didn't even have a sewage system. So she grew up surrounded by the smell of burning feces. She grew up in an area called Pigtown, which gives you some sense of how it was seen. See, there's a Pigtown homegirl over there. And Billie Holiday learned something when she lived here. She made herself a promise. She wasn't allowed in a lot of the stores because she was an African American. She promised herself she was never going to bow her head to any white man. So when she gets this threat from Harry Anslinger, she says in effect, "Screw you, I'm an American citizen, I'll sing my song, I'll do what I want." And that is the point at which the stalking and killing of Billie Holiday began. Harry Anslinger hated employing African Americans. He had a rule that no African American could be the boss of a white guy in his organization, but it was kind of hard to send a white guy into Harlem to stalk Billie Holiday. It'd be kind of conspicuous. So he employed a man called Jimmy Fletcher, and Jimmy Fletcher's job was to follow Billie Holiday for 2 years and watch everything she did. And Jimmy Fletcher fell in love with Billie Holiday because she was so amazing. And all his life he felt ashamed of what he did next. He busts her. She's put on trial. She said the trial was called the United States versus Billie Holiday, and that's how it fell. She's sent to prison. And when Billie Holiday gets out, she can't sing. You needed a license. You needed a cabaret performance license to perform anywhere where alcohol was served, and they wouldn't give it to her. Her friend Yolanda Bavan said to me, "What is the cruelest thing you can do to a person? Is to take away the thing they love." It's what we do to addicts all over the world today. I went out with a female chain gang in Arizona and made to wear t-shirts saying, "I was a drug addict," and dig graves. They're never going to work again. They've got a criminal record. And like those women, a lot of those women, Billie Holiday, in all that suffering, relapses. When she's in her early 40s, she collapses in New York, and she's taken to a hospital. The hospital refuses to have her because she's an addict. They take her to another hospital. She says to one of her friends that the narcotics agents aren't finished with her. She says, "They're going to kill me in there. Don't let them. They're going to kill me in there." On her hospital bed, she's diagnosed with liver cancer. They arrest her on a hospital bed. They handcuff her to the hospital bed. I interviewed the last man who was still alive, who was in that room, Eugene Callender, an incredible man. They take away all her candies, all her toys, everything she has, and she goes into withdrawal because she hasn't got any heroin. One of her friends, Maylie Duffy, manages to insist the doctors give her methadone. She starts to recover. 10 days later, they cut off the methadone and she dies. One of her friends said she looked like she had been violently wrenched from life. But here's the thing. Billie Holiday insisted on singing her song. She would go anywhere they'd have her. No matter what they did, she always sang Strange Fruit. And it really helped me to think about the addicts in my life, because I think there's going to be people in this room who are addicts in their life. And if we're honest, there's a bit of a drug warrior in all of us, and there's a bit of all of us that looks at them and thinks someone should stop you and feels really angry some of the time. And it really helped me to know that addicts can be heroes. Her friend Annie Ross, Billie Holiday's friend Annie Ross, said to me, "Billie Holiday wasn't weak. Billie Holiday was as strong as she could be." I wanted to understand how those dynamics continue into today. And I was introduced to someone, one of the best people I know, a former transsexual crack dealer in Brownsville, Brooklyn, called Chino Hardin. Chino was conceived in 1980 when his mother, who was a crack addict, was raped by his father, who was an NYPD officer. He's a child of the drug war in the purest sense. And Deborah, his mother, gets AIDS very early in the AIDS crisis because nothing was done to prevent the transmission of AIDS among drug users. In fact, the thing that did help, and in lots of places prevented the spread, the distribution of clean needles, was a crime. People were prosecuted under the Drug Paraphernalia Act. So his mother dies. And when he's 13, he becomes a crack dealer on his corner. And Chino really helped me to understand the dynamics behind drug dealing and what happens with drug dealing. I didn't check, but I'm guessing there's a liquor store on this street. There certainly isn't one far away, right? If we go into that, if we go into that liquor store, any of us tonight, and we try to steal the beer or vodka, and I apologize if you feel like doing that after I speak, they'll call the cops, and the cops will come and take us away, right? That liquor store doesn't need to be violent. If we go up to the local weed dealer or the local coke dealer and we try to steal their goods, they can't call the police, right? The police will come and arrest them. They've got to be terrifying. They've either got to fight you, or better yet, establish a reputation for being so frightening that you won't dare to take them on. And even though Chino is one of the most empathetic people I know, Chino had to learn to be terrifying. Chino had to discipline his gang, his 4 friends on his block, by whipping them if they got out of line. Chino had to shoot at people. Chino had to be aggressive and violent. The sociologist Philippe Bourgeois says that prohibition creates a culture of terror. This has got nothing to do with drugs, right? If you banned milk and people still wanted to buy milk, exactly the same dynamics would happen. This is not about drugs. This is about prohibition. You will have noticed that the liquor store over there, they're not going and shooting the people who work in the drinks aisle at Walmart, right? That never happens. Under alcohol prohibition, alcohol sellers were killing each other. So what happened is that Chino starts to rise through the Crips. He becomes a senior member of it. He's first of all sent to a youth prison called Sparford. To send Chino and his 4 fellow gang members to Sparford Prison, a youth detention facility, cost $1 million a year. I don't know if there's anyone here who can think of something better we could do in Brownsville, Brooklyn with $1 million a year than send 5 kids to be in stone cells, but if you've got any ideas, I'm happy to talk about them. Chino rises. His whole life is malformed. He starts using crack because, as he put it to me, I wanted to know what my mother chose over me. And when Chino's in his early 20s, he gets out of prison and he starts to read about the drug war. And he discovers something that blows his mind. This isn't a law of nature. This isn't something that just happens in the world. It's not like a tsunami. It's not like a hurricane. This is a political choice. What happened to Chino's mother, what happened to Chino, his life in Rikers, his life in a prohibited market, all of that, it didn't have to happen. Chino became a campaigner against the war on drugs. His first campaign was to shut down Sparford, the youth prison he was put in. And he succeeded. Sparford no longer exists. Chino is also a really articulate exponent of explaining how much this is still about what it was about with Billie Holiday. When Harry Anslinger found out Billie Holiday was a heroin addict, he also found out Judy Garland was a heroin addict. He told Judy Garland to take slightly longer vacations and told the studio she was going to be fine. Spot the difference. 17% of the people who sell drugs in the United States are African American. They make up 65% of the people who go to prison for it. Just outside Baltimore, at the same time that Chino was selling on his block, a person called Lee Maddox was standing on the I-95. Lee Maddox was a cop, and she was arresting anyone she could find who she suspected of being a drug user. Lee had long hair and a hot temper. Her job was to get numbers. She knew that if you busted people, the cops get to keep 80% of everything they take. If they find you with coke in your car and they see they can take your car away, they get to keep 80% of it. It was paying her wages. Lee was thrilled. Lee could not have been a stronger believer in the war on drugs. Lee signed up to be a cop because her best friend Lisa, who she grew up with, they used to share an ID, they looked just alike, they were always together, was murdered by what she believed was a drug gang. She signed up to be a cop with one reason in mind: to destroy drug gangs. That was why she went into it. But Lee is an honest person, and Lee noticed something. When you're a cop, if you arrest a rapist, the next week there's less rape in your town. If you arrest a dealer, well, no one thinks there's less dealing. There's always someone else on the corner. But crucially, Lee noticed something even more important. If you bust dealers, the murder rate actually goes up. And Lee was like, why would this be? How can that be? And what she discovered is that if you, say Chino establishes a reputation for terror on his block, he controls his block. If you kill Chino or arrest Chino, you just trigger a war between rival gangs to control his patch. You start a turf war. Huge numbers of people are killed in these turf wars. The Nobel Prize-winning economist Milton Friedman said there are 10,000 deaths a year in the United States, 3 9/11s as a result of those turf wars. And they're not just dealers. There are a lot of people being caught in the crossfire. I tell the story in my book about Tiffany Smith, a 3-year-old girl who's playing on her stoop in West Baltimore, gets hit in the crossfire. And Lee didn't know what to do with this insight. And then another of her best friends, Ed Totley, an agent who also believed very strongly in the drug war, goes to do an undercover drugs bust, and he's shot by the dealer, who just thought he was another dealer. And Lee goes and looks at Ed's body, and she thinks, I can't do this anymore. And Lee quit the police force, and she retrained as a lawyer, and now she spends her time getting the convictions quashed wherever she can for the drug arrests that she did as a cop. Lee is actually here today. I'm so proud to know her. And she's an extraordinary person. I wanted to know what life is like on the supply routes. This dynamic we're talking about, this dynamic of creating, as Charles Bowden, the writer, put it, the war on drugs creates a war for drugs. That's horrific in a lot of places. In this city, it's one of the worst. There's one city I can think of where it's even worse, Ciudad Juarez. The supply route into the United States for most drugs runs through Ciudad Juarez. It's on the border with Texas in El Paso. So I went there. I would stay every night in El Paso because it's not safe to stay in Juarez. It's the deadliest city in the world. And every morning I would walk across the bridge, and it was bizarre because you walk across the bridge into what feels like an American city. There's a KFC, right? There's a Denny's. You can buy a flat-screen TV. And murder has effectively been legalized. There is a 2% murder conviction rate in Juarez, and that 2% didn't do it. And the way it really helped me to understand the story of what's happened there is through the story of a woman called Marisela Escobedo. Marisela never took drugs in her life. She never sold drugs in her life. No one in her life used or sold drugs. Had no interest in it. She happened to live in Ciudad Juarez. She had a daughter called Ruby who was 14 years old. Marisela was a nurse, but she also had like a woodwork store. And one day a guy turns up at her woodwork store called Sergey. He turns up and he says, look, I've got a kid. I need some work. Will you help me? Have you got anything I can do? And Marisela's a kind of soft-hearted person, so she said, yeah, okay, I'll give you a job. And Sergey starts to flirt with her daughter, who's 14, and Marisela's like, get out of here, right? And Ruby runs away to go off with Sergey. And Marisela goes to the police, as anyone here would do, and says, look, this guy's 21, and he's having an affair with my daughter, who's 14, you've got to stop him. And the police do nothing, and Marisela's a bit puzzled. She's angered. She tries to get her daughter back. Her daughter won't come back. She tries to keep her daughter in her life. Her daughter gets pregnant. Marisela's heartbroken. But she tries to, she goes and sees her all the time. Ruby has a baby. And one day, Marisela turns up, and Ruby's not there. But her baby's there. And Sergey says, Ruby ran away. She went off with another man. And Marisela says, no, no, no. She didn't run off with another man and leave her child with you. I know she wouldn't do that. But he says, well, that's what happened. So Marisela decides to distribute leaflets all over Juarez saying, have you seen my daughter? Nothing happens. After a while, a kid called Angel calls her, and he's terrified, and she has to drive out far into the desert with him. And he says to her, I helped dispose of your daughter's body. Sergey killed her. I can tell you where we dumped the body. And she goes and she finds the bits of her daughter's body. And she goes to the police and she says, you've got to do something, and the police won't do anything. And she still doesn't quite understand why. And Marisela eventually campaigns, and she manages to get him put on trial. And in the witness box, Sergey breaks down, and he apologizes to her, and he says, I'm sorry for what I did, and he admits what he did. And 2 weeks later, he's acquitted. And he disappeared. And Marisela discovers that Sergey worked for the Zetas, the Mexican drug cartel. Now, if you imagine a housing project in Baltimore, let's say 5 or 10% of the economy in that housing project is in the hands of armed criminal gangs selling drugs. That housing project is going to be a lousy place to live. 70% of the economy of Ciudad Juarez is in illegal drugs. They can outbid the state. When I first went there, I was being shown around by a great guy called Julian Cardona, who's the Reuters correspondent. He kept introducing me to people who'd been killed by the police. And I said, you know, Julian, this is important, but I need to meet people who've been killed by the cartels. And he just laughed and said, no, you don't understand, Johann. When the cartels want to kill someone, they pay the police to do it. Maricela would not accept that there was no justice in northern Mexico in the age of Prohibition. She would not accept it. She decided to track down Sergei. She turns herself into a detective. She quits her job, and she spends 3 years tracking him all over Mexico. She becomes a crack detective, and with her friends, who are mothers of the missing, she walks across the desert. She walks thousands of miles, and after 3 years, she finds him. And she goes to the police, and they let him get away again. And she goes and stands outside the governor's mansion in Chihuahua, and she leads this protest, and she's become a symbol of everything. And she stands outside and she makes this amazing speech about how people in Mexico deserve justice. And in front of all the police, a man walks up to her and shoots her in the head. A woman whose wages you pay, Michelle Leonhardt, the head of the Drug Enforcement Agency, was asked about the 60,000 deaths of civilians in Mexico in the last 7 years. And I urge you to look up the clip. She said it was a sign of success in the war on drugs. When I went and talked to Berta, Maricela's best friend, in her shack in Juarez, I said to her, it was something that really stayed with me, what she said. I said to her, weren't you afraid? And she said, we were terrified, but sometimes your love for your kids is stronger than your fear. And there's something in the hope of that I contrast with what Michelle Leonhardt said that really stayed with me. Another thing I wanted to understand was what causes drug addiction. If you had said to me 4 years ago, what causes heroin addiction, I would have looked at you like you were a little bit simple-minded, and I would have said, heroin causes heroin addiction, right? For 100 years, we've been told a story that's so obvious, it's become part of our common sense. It's really easy. We think that if the first 20 people on these rows, I'm not making any comment on you, were to all use heroin for 20 days, because there's chemical hooks in heroin, our body would physically need the heroin, and that's what addiction is. We would physically crave it, right? The first hint I got that there may be something wrong with that theory was from a guy called Dr. Gabor Mate, who pointed out to me, if any of us step out onto the street now and we're hit by a car and we break our hip, we'll be taken to hospital, and it's very likely we'll be given a lot of diamorphine. Diamorphine is heroin. It's much better heroin than you're going to score on the streets because it's 100% pure, as opposed to street heroin, which is about 5 to 10%, right? You'll be given that heroin for a really long time. That's happening at Johns Hopkins, that's happening at every university in Baltimore, sorry, every hospital in Baltimore, it's happening at every hospital in the United States, every hospital in the developed world. People are being given a lot of heroin, right? You will have noticed something a bit weird, which is your grandmother was not turned into a junkie by her hip operation. If what we think about addiction is right, those people should be leaving hospital as addicts. That doesn't happen. And I was trying to process this, and I didn't know what to do with it. It seemed so weird, until I met a man called Bruce Alexander. He's a professor in Vancouver. And Bruce Alexander explained to me the old idea of addiction, the one that I believe, the one that almost all of us believe, comes from a series of experiments that were done earlier in the 20th century. They're really simple experiments. If you're feeling a bit sadistic, you can go home and do them yourself. You get a rat and you put it in a cage and give it 2 water bottles. One is just water, and one is water with either heroin or cocaine in it. If you do that, the rat will almost always prefer the drugged water and almost always kill itself. So there you go. Addiction, it's our theory confirmed. Until 1970s, Bruce comes along and says, hang on a minute, we're putting the rat in an empty cage, it's got nothing to do, let's try this differently. So Bruce built Rat Park. Rat Park is heaven for rats. Everything your rat could want, it's in Rat Park. It's got cheese, it's got coloured balls, it's got friends to have sex with, it's got tunnels. Everything a rat can want is in Rat Park. And they've got both the water bottles, the drugged water and the normal water. And of course they try both because they don't know what's in them. But here's the fascinating thing. In Rat Park, they don't like the drugged water. They hardly ever use it. None of them ever overdose. None of them ever use it in a way that looks compulsive. There's a human experiment with this that I can tell you about in a minute that's really interesting. I think there's a human experiment going on all around us in Baltimore about this. But what Bruce says is, This tells us that both the right-wing theory and the left-wing theories of addiction are wrong. The right-wing theory is you're morally flawed, you're a hedonist, you party too hard, you get hooked. The left-wing theory is the drug takes you over, it hijacks your brain. Bruce says, it's not your morality, it's not your brain, it's your cage. Addiction is an adaptation to your environment. There was a fascinating human experiment going on about this at the same time as Rat Park. It was called the Vietnam War. 20% of American troops in Vietnam were using smack. And if you look at the news reports from the time, they were really worried because they believed the old theory of addiction. So they were like, my God, all these people are going to come back and we're going to have hundreds of thousands of junkies on the streets of the United States. What happened? All the studies show they came back and almost all of them just stopped. They didn't go to rehab, they didn't go into withdrawal, they stopped. Because if you're taken out of a hellish pestilential jungle where you don't want to be, and it's a nightmare, and you could be killed at any moment, and you go back to your nice life in Wichita, Kansas, with your friends and your family, it's the equivalent of being taken out of the first cage and being put into the second cage. And this has huge implications for the war on drugs, obviously, because the war on drugs is based on the idea that the chemicals cause the addiction, and we need to physically eradicate those chemicals from the face of the earth. Now, I don't think that's possible, physically possible, to eradicate these chemicals. We can't keep drugs out of prisons, and we've got a walled perimeter, and we pay a lot of people to walk around them, so good luck keeping it out of the United States. But you can at least grant that that has a philosophical coherence, right? But if, in fact, that's not what causes addiction, if, in fact, the vast majority of people who use those drugs don't become addicted, if, in fact, isolation and pain are what causes addiction, that forces us to think differently about the drug war, because the drug war is built on the idea that what we should do with addicts is inflict more isolation and pain on them. In that prison I went to in Arizona, Tent City, they took me to the hole, that's what they call it, solitary confinement, and these women who were there, these desperate, addicted women, and I suddenly thought, this is the closest you will ever get to a literal human reenactment of the cage that guaranteed addiction. You know, and we cut them off even more because when they get out, just like with Billie Holiday, they won't be able to work, they won't be able to do the things they love. I think it also has deeper philosophical implications. There's a guy called Peter Cohen, who's a professor, who says we shouldn't use the word addiction, we should use the word bonding. Human beings have an absolutely innate need to bond. And the healthy bond, the bond that most of us have, is with each other. We bond with each other. But if you are deprived of the ability to bond with each other, whether you're traumatized or you're cut off or you're humiliated or isolated, you will bond with something that gives you pleasure. That might be a roulette wheel, that might be a bag of smack, but you will bond with something and you will keep going back to those bonds. If we want like the people I love to give up their bond with heroin, we need to give them alternative loving bonds. At the moment, we strip them of those bonds. Bruce talks about how in addiction we talk a lot about individual recovery, and that has huge value. We need to talk a lot more about social recovery. Something has gone wrong with us, not just as individuals, but as a group. And we need to think about the fact that we've created a society where a huge number of our fellow citizens cannot bear to be present in their lives without being heavily medicated. I want to tell you two stories about the end of the war on drugs. Good news, the war on drugs has begun to end. And I went to the places where it's begun to end. And if I'm totally honest, I actually put off going for a while because I thought if I go there and it didn't work, this would be the most depressing book ever written. But actually what I saw really blew my mind. In the year 2000, the same time that Lee is standing on the I-95 outside Baltimore and Chino is standing on his corner selling crack, a man called Bud Osborne was living homeless on the streets of the downtown east side of Vancouver. The downtown east side has and had the worst concentration of addicts in North America. It was regarded as the place at the end of the line and the city at the end of the line in North America. People called it Terminal City. And Bud's friends were dying all around him. People would use behind dumpsters so that the cops wouldn't see them, but if you use behind a dumpster so the cop doesn't see you and you start to OD, no one else sees you, your body is found 2 days later. And Bud said, I have to do something about this. I cannot just watch all my friends die. But he also thought, what can I do? I'm a homeless street addict. And Bud had a very small and very simple idea. He got together a load of the addicts and he said, when we're not using, which is most of the time, why don't we just patrol the alleyways? We'll have a timetable. And if we spot someone ODing, we'll call an ambulance. Really small idea. And they started to do it. And a few months passed, and the overdose rate started to really fall on the downtown east side. And that was great in itself, but it also meant the addicts started to think of themselves differently. They started to say, maybe we're not the pieces of rubbish people say we are. Maybe we can do something. And they started to go, loads of them en masse, to public meetings about the menace of the addicts. And they would sit at the back and they'd listen. And after a while, one of them would put up their hand and they'd say, I think you're talking about us. Is there anything we could do differently? And sometimes people would be really angry, and sometimes they'd be quite nice. And they'd say things like, well, you leave your needles lying around. And Bud said, that's fine. We'll extend the parade. We'll collect the needles at the end of every day. And they started to. And then Bud learned about Frankfurt, Germany. They had opened a safe injecting room, a place where you could go and legally use heroin. And the overdose rate had fallen dramatically. And Bud said, right, it's now happened in North America, we're going to make it happen. And they started to stalk a man called Philip Owen, who was the mayor of Vancouver. How can I describe Philip Owen? Picture Mitt Romney. Philip Owen was a rich right-wing businessman who had no idea about anyone who'd had any pain in their life, right? And they started to follow him everywhere he went. He'd actually said that addicts should all be taken to the local military base and detained there, which gives you some sense of where he was coming from. And they started to follow him everywhere he went. And they carried a coffin. And the coffin had written on it something like, who will die next, Philip Owen, before you open a safe injecting room? And this goes on for 2 years, and they're starting to get pretty disillusioned because nothing's changing and people are still dying in huge numbers. And one day, Philip Owen just says, who the hell are these people? And to his eternal credit, he goes incognito to the downtown east side and he just spends a lot of time with addicts. And his mind is blown. He had no idea. And Philip Owen goes to meet Milton Friedman, the Nobel Prize-winning economist, who'd grown up under alcohol prohibition and had a really smart analysis of drug prohibition, and learns from Milton Friedman. And Philip Owen comes back to Vancouver, and he holds a press conference. And he has the chief of police, and he has the coroner, and he has a representative of the addicts. And he says, I'm never going to talk about addiction again without an addict with me, because they understand it better than anyone. We're going to open the first safe injecting room in North America. We're going to have the most compassionate drug policies in North America, and things are going to change. Just you wait and see. And they open the first injecting room, and Philip Owen is deselected by his own party because they're so horrified. But so they select a right-wing candidate who's opposed to it, and that candidate is beaten by a more liberal candidate who wins and keeps it open. 10 years on, the results are in. Overdose has fallen by 80%, 80%. And average life expectancy on the downtown east side has improved by 10 years. You only get stats like that at the end of a war, which is what this is. Bud died last year. He was only in his early 60s, but he'd been a homeless addict in a drug war, and it takes a toll on you. And when he died, they sealed off the streets where he had lived homeless to have a memorial service, and enormous crowds of people came. And huge numbers of people in that crowd knew that they were only alive because of what he had done. If you're listening to me and you're thinking, the drug war is a really big thing and we are powerless and what can we do? I want to tell you, you are so much more powerful than you know. Bud was a homeless street addict. It is hard to think of a more disempowered person. He started a revolution that has led to the saving of thousands of people's lives. The Canadian Supreme Court, as a direct result of his activism, have ruled that addicts have an inalienable right to life, and that includes a safe injecting room, and that can never be taken away now. He did that by starting one day on one street with a bunch of addicts. I also wanted to go to the only place in the world that's decriminalized all drugs, from cannabis to crack, and tell you the story about it. In the year 2000, going back to that one, Portugal had one of the worst drug problems in Europe. 1% of the population was addicted to heroin. It's a worse drug problem than in Baltimore. It was mind-blowing. And every year they tried the American way, and every year things got worse. And the Prime Minister and the leader of the opposition got together, and they basically said, we can't carry on like this. We can't have a country where 1% of the population is addicted to heroin. Let's figure out what would actually work. So they said, look, why don't we set up a panel of scientists and judges and doctors to figure out what would actually deal with this, and let's agree in advance, all the political parties, that we'll do whatever they recommend. So it just took it out of politics. It would be like Obama and John Boehner agreeing to set up a panel and do what, well, it's hard to imagine them agreeing to anything, but you know what I mean? It would be like that. And so the panel goes away. I don't think they thought the panel would recommend what it did, but to be fair to them, they stuck by it. The panel comes back and says, decriminalise everything, but, and here's the crucial next step, take all the money we currently spend on arresting drug users, trying drug users, imprisoning drug users. Let's use all that money on really good drug treatment. And it's mostly not what we think of drug treatment of in the United States. Some of it was residential rehab, some of it was psychological support, hugely valuable. The biggest thing was learning the lesson of Rat Park. We could all be drunk now. Forget the drug laws. We could all be drinking vodka, right? Why aren't we? It's because we've got something to do. We've got meaning and purpose in our lives. We've got things we want to be present for in our lives, people we want to be present for. The aim of the Portuguese decriminalisation was to make sure that every addict in Portugal had something to get out of bed for. So the biggest element of the programme was subsidised jobs. Say you had a smack problem, used to be a mechanic. They'll go to a garage when you're ready, and they'll say, if you employ this guy for a year, we'll pay half his wages. One of the things was microloans for groups of addicts to set up businesses. One of them set up a removals firm. A group of 15 addicts set up a removals firm. And suddenly they had this incredible support group, because if you're one of those 14 and you relapse, the other guys have a really strong incentive to support you and help you and get you clean. And it's been 14 years now. And again, the results are in. Injecting drug use is down by 50% in Portugal. All the studies show addiction is down, overdose is massively down, HIV transmission is massively down. And one of the most moving interviews I did was with a guy called João Figueira. I'm saying that name wrong, I cannot say Portuguese names. They would keep trying to correct me and I would always get it wrong. He led the campaign against the decriminalisation. He was the top drug cop in Portugal. And he was thinking what a lot of people watching this will be thinking, which is surely if you decriminalise, you'll have a massive explosion of use, you'll have all sorts of problems. And João said to me, I'm paraphrasing the exact words are in the book, everything I said would happen didn't happen, and everything the other side said would happen did. And he talked to me about how ashamed he was that he'd spent 20 years arresting and harassing drug users. And he hoped the whole world followed Portugal's example. I don't want to get too Billy Graham on you, but I do feel like I've seen the future and it works. And, you know, two wars began in 1914, two global wars. One is the war on drugs that hasn't ended, and one was the First World War that lasted for 4 years. And when I was looking for the centenary of the First World War, I looked at those amazing images of the graves in Normandy in France, of all these graves stretched out for miles and miles. And I tried to imagine if all the people from the war on drugs were buried in one place, who would be there? You'd have Billie Holiday and all the songs she never got to sing. You'd have Chino's mother. You'd have Lee's friends, Lisa and Ed. You'd have Bud's friends who died behind dumpsters. You'd have a lot of people who were loved by people in this room. We've got a choice. We've got another century. We can fill that graveyard with far more people, or we can choose a policy of love and compassion that will save the huge number of those lives. It's up to us now. Thank you. Thanks very much. Okay, so we could do questions?
So we've got some time for some Q&A with Johann. So if you'd like to ask a question, there's a nice aisle right here. Please line up and use the microphone so everybody can hear you.
I'm going to actually just say that two things. One is that all the events I've done, almost all the questions have been from men, so I'm going to try and police it so we have like half women. And the other thing is, someone came up to me after an event and said, do you think there's a connection between the war on drugs and aliens? And I thought he meant like illegal aliens, undocumented workers, so I started giving an answer about like people smuggling and the Mexican cartels. And he said, no, I mean extraterrestrials. And I had to say, like, I don't think there's a connection between extraterrestrials and the war on drugs because I don't think extraterrestrials exist. And he looked horrified. So as long as your question is not about that, I will be very, very happy. So what should we do? Should we get people to come to this mic? What do you reckon? Do you want to... If anyone wants to come, because it's being filmed, so we should probably get someone to... If you just want to ask a question, you want to come to this microphone? Yeah, sure. Do you want to come first? Thank you.
Good evening. Very good presentation. You mentioned about a country that has legalized all drugs, I believe. Can you describe about the country and how is that working out as far as Is it helping society, young people? How are they being educated as far as the usage?
Yeah, so the country has decriminalised everything, and it's an important distinction. Decriminalisation means you don't punish people for using. Legalisation means you establish a legal route to getting the drug, right? So in Portugal, they've decriminalised, but they haven't legalised. So it deals with some of the problems, but not others. The way I would explain it is, they've shut down Orange is the New Black, but they still have Breaking Bad. And that's not good enough, right? So I went to a country where they legalised heroin. I'll give you a good example. I'm, as you can tell from my voice, British, but I'm also a Swiss citizen. And Switzerland legalised heroin. And this is really shocking because Switzerland is a really right-wing country. When I told one of my Swiss uncles that I was writing a book about the war on drugs, he said, I know what we should do about the war on drugs. We should make the addicts dig their own graves and shoot them into it. Is that what your book says? I had to go, not quite. So what they did in Switzerland, if you're a heroin addict, you go to your doctor and the doctor will refer you to a clinic. And at that clinic, you can go every morning or every afternoon, whenever you want to go, and they'll give you heroin. They'll give you whatever dose of heroin you ask for. You can't take it out with you, but you can be given it there. And the results are really fascinating. There's lots of interesting results. One of them was unexpected. I asked this doctor there, Rita Mangi, so they can carry on for as long as they want with the heroin, and she's like, yeah. She said, but the fascinating thing is, almost everyone, because their life stabilizes, because the chaos of street use and having to scramble for street use and all of the stuff, the prostitution and the property crime, all of that stops, most of them start to get their lives together. They get jobs, and they choose to reduce the heroin over time. Because their reality gets better, they choose to stay in reality longer. And, you know, 70% of Swiss people voted to keep that policy twice, partly because there's just so much less street crime. The street prostitution ended, there was much less mugging, much less violence. So yeah, the results from legalization are really clear. Should we go to the next? Great, thank you. Can we take a woman? Do you mind if I sorry, and I promise we'll come to you. Thank you. Hello.
Good So I work for a provider agency that does community-based alternatives for kids in juvenile detention. We use a wraparound advocacy approach, which is all about connection. So your Huffington Post piece is why I'm here today. It really resonated with us. But last week I was in Pennsylvania in Harrisburg at the Capitol talking to a legislator who very clearly was like, you know, people are addicts, they make those choices, we have to punish them. So what is a narrative that we could use, those of us who our experiences tell us what you're saying in your book, that we could use for naysayers like that who are in positions of authority and power to actually make those changes? Who might think if it's like fluffy or, you know, it's feel good or you want to hug a thug kind of thing, which I think is great.
Well, thank you for the work you're doing, because that's sorely needed and really important. I guess what I would say is so you're right, we've had a massive dehumanization of addicts in America and Britain and all sorts of other places. There's no other minority I can think of where when they die, lots of people say, well, they brought it on themselves. I remember when Amy Winehouse died, or Corey Monteith, the kid from Glee. Lots of people just saying, well, they brought it on themselves. I mean, you wouldn't get that with any other minority. Even a really homophobic person, if Elton John died, wouldn't go, well, good. Do you know what I mean? Like, well, they'd be really extreme as a homophobe if they did that. It's about humanizing addicts and telling the real stories of addicts. And it's partly about people just coming out, you know? Like, how did we change, you know, 1963, the Stonewall riots, right? 2,000 years of gay people being persecuted. The defenders of gay people, the pro-gay position was to say, they're not evil, they're sick, right? That was like the pro-gay position. And what happened? People told the stories of gay people in their lives. And incredibly brave gay people all over America, all over the world, just said, actually, I'm gay and I'm not the way you think I am. So I think it's partly stories of addicts coming out. It's partly, you know, like you have on the window Black Lives Matter, which is hugely important. I think we need the message addicts' lives matter, you know? One of the most horrendous things that I did for the book was I went in Arizona, the place I went with the chain gang. I interviewed this woman called Donna Leon Ham, who works on prisoners' rights in Arizona. And I said to her this question I ask people all the time. Any journalists in the room steal this question, it always gets something interesting. Just tell me about something that shocked you. And she went through this long list, and somewhere down the list she said, there was the time they put that woman in a cage and cooked her, that was bad. And I did the facial expression that a lot of you guys did just then. And I said, sorry Donna, could you go back a second? There was a woman called Marsha Powell, about whom very little was known when I started to do the research. She kept being arrested either for having meth or for prostituting herself to get meth. She was in her early 40s, and one day she woke up in Perryville prison and she was suicidal. And the doctor didn't believe she was suicidal. But to punish her for making noise, they took her and they put her in this cage. Bear in mind, it's Arizona. This is an exposed cage in the desert. And they left her there. And she screamed and she begged for water, and the guards mocked her. And eventually she collapsed, and by the time they called an ambulance, she had been cooked. No one was ever criminally punished for what they did to Marsha Powell, because addicts' lives don't matter in our culture. And I then went and found the father of her children and got the story of her life, which is heartbreaking and very like Billie Holiday's story. Like Billie Holiday, she was prostituted as a child. She was trying to stun her grief. I think it's partly about explaining that addiction is caused by pain. And we need to just tell a lot more real stories of real addicts. And I actually think most people are pretty compassionate. Most people are decent people. And most Americans are lovely, like all of you. And, if we tell those stories, I think that kind of mad, vindictive, let's cook them in cages mentality, I think will not thrive. Thank you. Thanks. Sheree. Hi. Hello.
Hi. I was wondering, so they've decriminalized everything in Portugal. Do you think that with the differences in American society that the same thing would work in the United States, because we're such a larger country with a more diverse society and social problems? They're a lot different than Portugal's?
Yeah. Professor Jeffrey Myron at Harvard calculated, I think the figure is, if you add up all the money that's spent on the drug war and all the taxes you would raise from drugs if you tax them the way we tax alcohol, you would have $43 billion a year, right? You could do what Portugal did on steroids with $43 billion a year. That is an enormous sum of money. So yeah, transferring the money from something that makes addiction worse to something that helps people to turn around their lives absolutely would work. Of course, the details would be different, and what works in Mississippi may not be what works on the Upper East Side, and also, they'd be all, and we need to experiment cautiously, and we need to be humble, and we need to say some bits will work and some bits won't. But I absolutely think it would work in the United States. And I think, we've already seen the legalization of marijuana in Colorado and Washington, and I tell the story of how that campaign, that incredible campaign by fantastic people, was won in Colorado. Yeah. I think it's the short answer. Can we go to a woman next? Is there a woman in the line? I can't. Yeah, hello, come forward. Oh, sorry, the light is blinding me. Hi. It was just, I literally couldn't see you at all. Hello.
Hi. I have a question more about the process of researching, and
Sure.
I'm wondering the connections, the broader connections that you made. How much of that became clear as you were traversing geographic space, and how much was a part and parcel of the after analysis?
I'm so glad no one asked me about the process of writing the book. I'm so happy. Annie Dillard's book, The Writing Life. Anyone who wants to be a writer, please buy that book immediately. It's amazing. Has this brilliant analogy from Thoreau. I was going to say it was from Thoreau, but I actually haven't read Thoreau, so I didn't want to sound pretentious. Apparently, I know nothing about nature either. Apparently, if you want to find a beehive and you don't know where it is, what you do is you wait with a big, jar, catch the bee and hold it there for a minute. And if you open the jar again, the bee will it freaks out and will always fly in the direction of the hive. So you chase the bee as far as you can, you're going to lose it. You wait there, catch another bee, let that one go, and if you do that 10, 15 times, you find the hive, right? That was basically the process of writing my book. So I just started with a list of people who I thought were interesting on this subject, and I went and interviewed them, and I said, who else should I talk to? And I chased loads and loads of bees, and then I found Lee, I found Chino, I found so many people. So it was a really fascinating process that just led me, and sometimes you would speak to a chain of 9 people, and they'd all be nice and interesting, but you didn't get anything for it, and then suddenly I'd find Lee, and it was, so yeah, that's the process. Hooray! Sir, hi.
Hello.
Hi.
I was very interested to hear your take, refreshing to hear that the fundamental cause of addiction is pain, and that the solution, whether it's the dysfunctional solution or a societal solution, would be providing bonding. And I was just simply curious, do you have any familiarity with the sociologist Brené Brown and her work in shame and the unspoken role that shame has in our society as almost a universal cause for disorder, unhappiness, and malcontent? I know I came across her work a number of years ago. She's also from Texas, and as you said, you've had the chance to visit. It changed my life. And so to hear those words yet again in a different context was something I felt like I wanted to take a moment and get up and reference.
You are the second person to recommend her, so I will definitely, I promise I will go and read.
The best place to start is she has a video on YouTube, a TEDx talk that went viral. It was one of the most harrowing moments of her life to talk about shame, because she herself is very introverted and struggles with it herself. So there's a genuine nature to the way she comes across. Watching that was what led me to the rest of her work.
It's interesting because there is someone I wrote about in the book who talks a lot about shame. He's a fascinating person. During the Holocaust in the Budapest ghetto, there was a woman called Judith Marte who was convinced she was about to be murdered by the Nazis. She was Jewish. Her parents had in fact already been murdered by the Nazis in Auschwitz, but she didn't know it yet. And she went up to a Christian stranger and said, "Take my baby, take him." And the Christian stranger did. And that kid grew up to be a guy called Gabor Mate, who's a doctor on the downtown east side. Some people here will know his work. He's a fantastic person. And Gabor started to work with really hardcore addicts. And what he noticed is that there was one thing that they all had in common. They all had horrific childhoods, like horrific sexual abuse, physical abuse, like far more than would be statistically representative of the wider population. And Gabor himself had addictions. Doesn't sound so bad, but it actually was really problematic in his life. He would compulsively, massively buy CDs that he never listened to, right? Which is not quite a crack addiction, but he would abandon women in the middle of labour, run off and buy loads of CDs he didn't listen to. And he started to think about the childhood trauma he had and the childhood trauma of these people. And he looked into this, and this is a fascinating thing, and this is related to Rat Park. Remind me to say how it's related to Rat Park if I forget. Something called the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study, or Survey, I always get that wrong. And they basically study the effect of trauma on children. And what he found is for every seriously traumatic event that happens to a child, they are 2 to 4% more likely to grow up to be an injecting drug user as an adult. There is a stronger connection between childhood trauma and adult addiction than there is between diabetes and obesity, which is mind-blowing. The way Gabor explains it is, it's related to the shame they feel. When you're a kid, we internalize the way our caregivers treat us, right? Usually it's your mother, but it could be anyone. So if when you're upset and in pain, your mother reassures you and calms you down, over time you'll reassure yourself and calm yourself down. If your mother or caregiver can't do that, if in fact they react to your crying with indifference or indeed hostility, you will treat yourself like that as you get older, and you'll be much more likely to need external soothing and external drugs. It's related to Rat Park, because at first I thought, oh, are these like different theories about how to explain addiction? But then it kind of occurred to me, if you go through childhood trauma, it's much harder to trust the world. It's much harder to form bonds with the world. You're much more suspicious of the world. There'll be a lot of people in this room who know that. You're much more likely to be isolated. You're much more likely to be like the rats in the first cage and the rats in the second cage. And I think that's where it plays a key role in addiction. Should we take there's a woman in the line, and then we'll go to, thank you. Hello. Thank you for your question.
Hi, thank you so
Hi.
much. This is really fascinating, and I'm looking forward to reading the book. I had a question about the UN Convention on Drugs, and whether you've had any opportunity to talk to anyone affiliated with the UN and you know, changing policy internationally.
Yeah, I'm glad you asked about that. I interviewed the woman who used to be the head of, I don't want to get it wrong, one of the main UN drug agencies, Cindy Fazy. She's a British woman. It's fascinating. The origins of this are so interesting. Harry Anslinger, the man who creates the hysteria about marijuana, the man who plays this role in Killing Billie Holiday, was the crucial figure in writing those UN things. There's a quote from him, which I think should be the slogan for the drug war. When lots of countries came to him and said, we don't think this policy is going to work, he said, I've made up my mind, don't try to confuse me with the facts. And it's very important, this global drug war is imposed from the United States. The way it worked is, so give you an example, Mexico, you think about Maricela and her story. Mexico had a really good drug policy in the 20s and 30s. They kept drugs legal. There was a doctor in charge of drug policy. He said marijuana wasn't very harmful and we should treat addicts with compassion. And Anslinger says, shut that thing down, right? And Mexico refuses. So Anslinger cut off the supply of legal opiates for painkillers to Mexican hospitals. And they writhe in agony in Mexico, and the Mexican government has to give in. After the Second World War, there were countries that were still holding out, like Thailand. Britain actually resisted in some ways. And basically the US is absolutely dominant at the end of the Second World War. Weirdly, it's one of the few things that the US and the Soviet Union agreed on. And so these two superpowers unite to right this disastrous. So the UN Office of Drug Control is this body that imposes the drug war on the world. It's mainly funded by the US and under US pressure. And they do, there's really fascinating things. I'll just say one other thing about that, and then I'd better go on to the question. But even the UNODC admit a fact that really threw me when I read it. If I said to you, what proportion of currently illegal drug use doesn't do any harm to the user? Don't become addicted, don't have any health problems, no harm at all. It's 90%, 90%. The overwhelming majority, which is kind of hard to get your head around, because we don't see, if I say to you, picture an alcohol user, you picture someone in a bar having a beer, right? If I say to you, picture a cocaine user, you picture an addict. Because the nature of the drug war, even though actually cocaine users are no more likely to be addicts than alcohol users, and in fact, far fewer cocaine users proportionately die than alcohol users as a result of their drug, it's because the drug war drives normal drug use underground so we don't see it. Right? We just don't know about it. You would be pretty foolish if you were to come up to me and announce on Facebook or anywhere that you are a cocaine user. Your boss is Googling you. You don't want that, right? You can not get jobs. So the drug war creates this weird effect that reinforces itself, where it creates a distorted picture of drug use that then feeds the drug war itself. Anyway, that's my free association on the basis of your question.
We just need to get there.
Talking
to those folks and trying to impress.
I don't think it's about talking to those guys. I don't think political change ever happens by talking to the people at the top.
Okay, well, that's probably exactly right.
Exactly. Philip Owen on his own was never going to make that change.
Yeah.
In a way, like Chomsky always says, they're the last people to speak. Chomsky always says he disagrees with the Quaker slogan, "Speak truth to power."
Yeah,
it's just like, I don't need to tell the truth to Henry Kissinger. He knows he's just a psycho. We don't need to tell the truth to those people. They know the truth. We need to make them change. And the only way to do that is for us to bond together and demand it.
Brilliant answer. Thank you.
Thank you. Hi. I like your tie.
Thank you. So I'm doing a story right now about the impact of the war on drugs on a community that you could call kind of the ground zero for the war on drugs in Baltimore. And they're kind of addressing what you talked about, kind of how the conditions create the addiction, it's not the drugs. And they're a community that's kind of at odd, trying to keep the police away from what they're doing. And the police here have a new plan to send all these new officers into this community. But are there other examples of these types of kind of holistic, kind of community-based efforts where community members are just trying to organize themselves? Because I know the war on drugs is a federal policy, but like in Baltimore, it's implemented by the local law enforcement. And I know laws on marijuana have become eased in Maryland and decriminalized or legalized elsewhere, but with heroin and harder drugs, it seems like there's no end in sight to legalizing that, or at least kind of easing some of the punitive measures being faced. And also, the stat really stuck out to me about how when you arrest one drug dealer, there's so much more violence that results of it. But it seems like, and I know you said it's kind of crazy to try to reason with the people in power, but it seems like that's not, people are just ignoring that, or people in power are ignoring that, or just pretending that's not the reality. So if you have any insight into that.
That's a really interesting question. I would say the best example is Vancouver. It's interesting, Lee put me onto a guy called Matthew Fogg. I quote in the book a speech he gave, and I think this dynamic will inevitably happen in Baltimore until we end the drug war. If you've got a law that is broken by half the population, which the drug laws have been, you can't put half the population of the United States in prison, although, to be fair, you are giving it a fair shot. So what are you going to do? You're going to go after the most unpopular and despised groups. There's a quote from Matthew Fogg in the book that he said in a speech. He was a cop in D.C. I'm paraphrasing, I don't have the exact words here. He basically went to his boss one day and said, "Hey boss, why when we do drug raids do we only ever go to the black neighborhoods? I'm pretty sure white people use drugs." And his boss said something like, "Well, of course they do. But white people get lawyers, and white people know judges, and white people know journalists. Go for the low-hanging fruit." And I don't think there's any way. So I'm all for moderate reform, but ultimately compassion within the framework of prohibition and a drug war ain't going to get us very far. Any incremental change is better. If it improves one person's life, brilliant. I'm in favor of it. I'm not one of these people who says things should stay bad to prove how bad they are and then things will change. Any incremental change is good. But I don't think, people say, a shift in policing. sure, those things can be beneficial, but ultimately, if we've transferred drugs to armed criminal gangs and we've got drug laws that can only ever be enforced against despised minorities, it's going to be awful. I'm sorry that's not a more hopeful. But there is hope because, you know, countries have... And it's worth saying as well, because we talked about legalizing. With something like heroin, legalization means different things for different drugs, right? No one wants there to be a crack aisle in CVS. No one is proposing that, right? The way legalization works for different drugs is, it's really important to understand what we have at the moment is anarchy. Unknown criminals sell unknown chemicals to unknown users in the dark. We don't know what's going on, right? We already have, so what we need to do is expand a web of regulation, legal regulation to cover that. What's important to understand, we don't need to invent anything new. Those webs of regulation already exist for dangerous drugs. You know, we have one web of regulation for alcohol that I would encourage people to expand to cover cannabis, probably party drugs like ecstasy. We have a web of regulation for, you know, we can't go and buy just like powerful sleeping pills in CVS, much to my dismay because I've got jet lag at the moment. You know, that web of regulation where you have to go to your doctor, you would cover that, you would include that to cover things like heroin, as they've done in Switzerland so successfully. With things like crack and meth, it's hard to know what you do. You might have an adaptation of the Vancouver model where you would have some safe spaces where you could go and use, provided you didn't leave. But you know, it's about regulating. Legalization doesn't mean an anarchic free-for-all. What we have now is an anarchic free-for-all. Legalization is a way of regulating and extending control. Great, should we go to the next woman in the line? Hello, oh, you are in fact next in the line. Great, thank you.
So I have a couple questions. So,
do you mind if we just do one? Because quite a lot of people want to. Sure, sorry.
So I guess my question is how, I came a little bit late, so I don't know if you already addressed this, but how did you come to this topic for your research, and what's your background with drugs, and what was your initial mentality before you started really understanding the war on drugs?
I have already answered that, so I'll just say very quickly that we had addiction in my family, cocaine and tranquilizer addiction. And that was a big motive for me. And like a lot of people who have that background, I was always drawn to relationships with addicts. And I was actually in a relationship, an on and off relationship with someone who had a very bad crack problem. So those were my motives, really.
Great. I guess a second, just really quick. I know, would you consider like the clinics in Switzerland, and also in Vancouver, to be kind of analogous to like methadone clinics for drug addicts, where they're kind of or even like to like nicotine patches to like sort of ease your addiction off?
All those places prescribe methadone as well. Basically, with something as incredibly complex as human addiction, you need to have a range of options. You need to have a broad menu. Anyone who says there's one solution to addiction, and I have found it and it is this, is a charlatan, and you shouldn't listen to them. Addiction is really complicated, and different things will work for different people. So methadone should be on the menu for people who want it. Abstinence-based treatment should be on the menu for people who want it. Being reconnected to a job, Portugal style, should be a big part of the menu. There's a whole range of things, and I'm in favour of all of them. I don't want to take anything off the menu. I want to add more things to it. I'm glad you mentioned nicotine patches, because it's a point I wanted to make, and I forgot to make it in my speech. It's important to understand there is a chemical component to addiction, right? It's not that the story we've been told is totally false. It's that it's a relatively small part of the picture. And we actually know statistically from an experiment that people in this room will have taken part in what percentage it is. We know menthol cigarettes are less addictive than tobacco cigarettes, right? And we know that the chemically compelling part of tobacco is nicotine. So when in the early 90s they invented nicotine patches, there's this huge wave of optimism. You see these statements by American officials who are like, great, smoking's going to end because you're going to be able to get the drug you're addicted to without the filthy carcinogenic smoke. And what happens? There's going to be people wearing nicotine patches in this room wanting to go out for a cigarette. They don't work very well. 17% of people who use nicotine patches can stop, 83% can't. That tells us that 17% is the chemical component is enough to stop your addiction, right? That's a lot. If you can stop 17% of smoking, that's a huge number of lives. I'm not for a minute dismissing that. But 17% is a lot less than 83%, and the 83% is all this other stuff we're talking about. Should we go to the next? Oh, there's in fact a woman next. Let's just go for affirmative action. And let's do it. Damn those men.
No, I like men, but anyway. First of all, thank you, seriously.
Oh, thank you.
And it's not just about the addiction or people who are seen as addicts. It's about the fact that you're creating a more vibrant conversation about pain in the human species, and how as a human species we need to learn to face emotional pain and learn to deal with it in more intelligent ways, because it affects all kinds of things. So in Baltimore County we have a school, we call it a consciousness school, and we work with everyone, addicts and non-addicts and all walks of life, and we teach people how to bond with themselves and with one another. We use, holistic techniques, meditation and breathing and movement and all kinds of things. And I have the honor of being able to train what we call psycho-spiritual facilitators to help people with these really deep parts of themselves, including addiction. And not just addiction of substances, but addiction to behaviors. And I would just love to hear from you. I know what I say to people. I mean, I read your thing about love songs, right? We should be singing love songs. So I know what I say to the people that I train when they have a concern about whether loving these people too much is going to somehow make them codependent, like to be manipulated by an addict. I know what I say to the people I'm training. I would love to hear what you would say.
Thank you. Thank you for what you said, and thank you for the work you do. That's a big question. When you were saying that, I pictured the clinic in Portugal that I went to, that I'm blanking on the name of. The name is in the book. And it was so moving. I'd been there, I can't remember how much longer after it was since I went to Tent City and the chain gang, but it was like, I think 6 months or something like that. And there were all these addicts in this room, and they were being massaged, and they were being taught to play trust games and how to express their feelings. And it was this really emotionally overpowering. I really wanted to fly back to Arizona, grab those women and take them to this clinic in Portugal. And I think you're totally right, and I actually want to write more about and research more about how we do the things we're doing. So come and talk to me afterwards, because I'd be really interested. I hate the concept of codependency. I've always hated it. I think it's absolute nonsense. It's loving someone, right? I think, that show, is it called Intervention? The show that
yes,
is...
I know that
I think
show.
Intervention is a deeply evil show. It is the importing of the drug war logic into our own lives, right? The idea that you should say to bear in mind, right, it is disconnection that is the main driver of addiction. The idea that you should say to an addict, I'm going to cut you off, and we're all as a group going to cut you off, unless you go to rehab, which, by the way, doesn't work very well. I mean, that's barbaric. That's exactly the wrong thing to do. The thing to do with addicts in your life, and this is very hard, and I'm not saying it's easy, and I find it difficult, I'm finding it particularly difficult at the moment for various reasons, is to say, I unconditionally love you. And whatever you do, whether you're clean or whether you're using, whether you are sick or whether you're well, I will always come and sit with you and try to be present with you. That is the only thing you can ever do that will help an addict. And it will be really hard, and a lot of the time you won't be able to stomach it. But it's the only thing that's ever going to work.
Well, you're helping us. We all need to develop a language that moves from codependency to love, and I completely agree
Down
with you.
codependency.
Yeah, totally. Okay,
Thank you, thanks. Should we get to...
So I think we've got time for 2 more questions.
Brilliant. Hello.
Hi, my name is Bonnie Lane. I'm formerly homeless and a 2016 candidate for mayor of Baltimore. And you've given me a lot of work to do on my platform, in which I include full legalization of marijuana. My question to you is this, which I find with ending homelessness or any societal issue. We have the money to do it tomorrow. However, if we actually end the war on drugs tomorrow with all of these great things that have been done in other countries, we're opposing capitalism. It's just like trying to get the money out of politics. So you're taking jobs away from billions of people in the prison industrial complex, etc., that facilitate the war on drugs. So what are the steps to oppose that and actually solve the problem?
That's a super interesting question. Thank you. And I hope people here vote for you. One of the biggest backers of the anti-marijuana legalization in California was the prison guards union, and I found that so depressing. What I would say to those people, you're right, some people will lose their jobs when we end the war on drugs. Border agents, some cops, although I can think of plenty of better things cops could be doing, prison guards, there will be some people. What I would say is, let's retrain all those people to provide compassionate love and support for addicts. There's loads of stuff they can do. You know, like, it's not about saying to them, you're on the scrap heap. Sometimes people say as well, you know, oh, if you and this is a real concern actually, if you legalize, you're going to have a huge number of young men who've made a reasonable living drug dealing who are going to be unemployed. You know, some places it's like taking General Motors out of Detroit, you know? And I suspect that would be the case here in Baltimore. And you would need to accompany it with significant economic support. I mean, you would also be healing an enormous amount of devastation in those communities, and you would see the return of African American men who are currently massively incarcerated. You would have to, I mean, I think one thing it's very easy to lobby for is, you know, just pardons. Governors and the president just mass pardoning of people for these harmless offences. So yeah, I don't feel that totally answered your question, but I think I got somewhere there. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. And should we go to the next? It's a man. Hooray. You've got to give a really testosterone-y question now to compensate. Just absorb.
Well, I first want to say thank you for your talk. And sort of piggybacking off the last question, there's like a recent speaker here who wrote a book called Drug War Capitalism, focusing on Latin America, specifically Mexico, Colombia, and sort of superimposing this talk about the drug war on movements within global capital, and looking at, in particular, like Mexico, where you're right, there is a coordination between the police and the cartels, and the huge victims of this a lot of times are labor organizers, and a lot of times like indigenous people who are sitting on really rich resources. And again, there's like a rich amount of literature on the influence of like the private prison system in the United States and how that benefits but also perpetuates the lobby for the war on drugs here. And I wonder whether you think there's any sort of solution in the States without addressing that influence on politics, and whether you did any research on the differences in places that did legalize drugs and comparing their prison industries and those influences as well.
That's interesting. That's really interesting. That's super interesting. There's loads of things that come out of that. One thing I thought of when you said that is a story that I uncovered for the book that I don't think has been really told since it happened. It's a crazy story. It tells you loads about the drug war. When drugs were first banned 100 years ago in 1914, there was a pretty big loophole written into the law. It said, this doesn't cover addicts. We're not talking about them. They can go to the doctor and get their drugs, right? Basically the Swiss model. And loads of doctors just carried on prescribing heroin to anyone who needed it because they thought, well, better they get it from me than from a gangster, right? And that loophole was shut down mostly by Hari Anslinger, state by state, right? And one of the last places to shut it down was California because it was really popular. The mayor of Los Angeles goes and stands in front of a heroin clinic and says, you will not shut this down, right? And I tell the story in the book of why it was shut down in California. It turns out the local Chinese drug gangs were really annoyed that in Nevada, drug addicts had to come and buy drugs from them, but in California, they could go to the doctor and get them. So they bribed the federal narcotics agents to introduce the drug war. They paid them to crack down. At the birth of the drug war, armed criminal gangs are paying for it to be introduced. That tells you something about who benefits from the war on drugs. And you're totally right, that dynamic is insane in Mexico, like we were talking about. And I remember the guy who I went to Texas and had the unfortunate jack-in-the-box accent incident with, you know, Rosalio Reta. I actually surprised someone recently by saying, of all the people I met for the book, he was the one I felt most sorry for. He grew up in Laredo on the border with the Texas side of the border, which is like basically the same place as Nuevo Laredo on the Mexican side. And when he was 13, they used to go all the time back and forth over the border. When he was 13, he was recruited to be a hitman for the Zetas. Between the age of 13 and 17, he killed 70 people. And he beheaded them and dissolved their bodies. I mean, like horrendous stuff. And he would talk about how in Mexico, he would just go out with the police on his murders sometimes. They would literally accompany him. So you're right, there's like a nexus there. That's not going on in the United States in the same way. I don't want to imply... There are some people who are kind of conspiratorial and think it works that way. Now, that's not the case in America. In terms of do we need to get that influence out of politics? Yeah, I mean, virtually every problem in this country can't be solved until you deal with the corruption problem. Why are we not dealing with global warming? the oil companies own your politicians. Why are we not dealing with the healthcare crisis? The big pharma owns your politicians. You know, it's why Obamacare is good, but not that good. So you're absolutely right. That's a much bigger question than just, you know, the drug war, although you're absolutely right. We can't deal with the drug war without dealing with that. And you asked, just one last thing, you asked about what was the difference with Portugal and Switzerland, and that's super interesting. One of the biggest differences, there's no ghettos in Switzerland and Portugal. What they couldn't do is act like the people who were addicts were others. Do you know what I mean? Like, so in Switzerland, if you're an addict in Switzerland, Switzerland is a nice little, like, the picture is Switzerland. Like, it's a nice little clockwork place with, like, lovely ordered parks. And if you're a heroin addict, people see that you're a heroin addict. They don't have the equivalent of West Baltimore, where, you know, it's kind of shut away and ghettoed away. They don't have any of that. And that was really important. So part of the job, obviously, we would like to dismantle ghettoization in the United States, but part of it is just about humanizing people within ghettos and saying, you know, we're all people, we all deserve a chance to live, we all deserve a chance to be happy, and we can choose policies that do that. Thank you all for all your questions. I really like them. Thank you. Thanks. Oh, I should have said I will now sign your books if you want me to.
And we'll be open for until 10 o'clock, so please feel free to hang around, talk to Johann, grab a beer or a glass of wine or a cup of coffee, and buy some books.
Every weekend,